Okay, well, welcome back everybody. Welcome back everybody. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce for you this evening our speaker, our president, Professor Penny Fielding. Penny Fielding is Grierson Professor of English Literature at the University of Edinburgh, and she's also Research Director for the Department of English Literature at the University. She studied for her DPhil at the University of Oxford, held lectureships at the University of Bristol and Trinity College Dublin. She's been a visiting lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania and a visiting research fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. She's published extensively on Scottish literature, be that Scott, Stevenson and Spies as well. And of course she's our president, who we're delighted to now hear from and give the address to the memory of Sir Walter Scott. So Penny, it's a delight to have you here. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Lucy, so much. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the club and fellow readers of Scott, thank you so much for the honour of inviting me to be your president this year. It's a recognition for which I am deeply grateful. And I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little about what Scott has meant to me over the long period of time that I've spent reading him. It is perhaps surprising that I should come to specialise in my research on Scott and on Scottish literature more generally. Because although I am a borderer, I was born and brought up on the wrong side of the border in a small village in Cumbria. The oldest building in our village was a 15th century peel tower built to defend the inhabitants and their livestock from marauding Scots who rode south on reaving excursions. Happily, those sentiments are long past, and indeed were past when, in July 1797, Walter Scott and his brother John set out in August on a tour of the English Lake District. While staying at the spa village of Gilsland, Scott met a certain Charlotte Carpenter, or Charpentier, and on Christmas Eve of that year they were married in Carlisle, the city in which my own parents got married. Now, Carlisle, it's true, does feature frequently in the minstrelsy of the Scottish border as the place where Scottish border reivers met their judicial end. Many outlaw heroes of the ballads end up executed there. But Scott also found inspiration in the Cumbrian landscape and its stories. His 1805 lyric poem, Helvellyn, is about the death of Charles Gough on the Cumbrian mountain of the title. And this was a very popular story in the 19th century and was famously depicted in a painting by Edwin Landseer. In case you don't know the story, it's a kind of Cumbrian Greyfriars Bobby, though rather more traumatic. Gough went missing when walking across Striding Edge, and his body was later found attended by his faithful terrier. Scott was accompanied by Wordsworth when he visited Helvellyn, and both of them wrote a poem about Gough's story. And I think Scott's poem is quite a lot more engaging than Wordsworth's. And it's thanks to the new edition of Scott's poetry, led by Alison Lumsden, that is reintroducing us to Scott's shorter verse, in addition to the great narrative poems, that we can read these stories. And the Helvellyn poem can be found in the superb volume of the shorter poems, edited by Peter Garside and Gillian Hughes. I'm sorry to tell you, however, that Peter and Gillian remind us about the difficult question of what the dog ate during the 3 months that it took rescuers to find Gough's rather obviously gnawed body. Sir Walter draws a discreet veil. Despite these connections between Scott and Cumbria, I didn't read any Scott until I went to university and was studying the Romantic period. In those days, there was a fairly limited choice of authors that students could write about. Now, I was pretty interested in Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats, and they went by okay. But when the next poet up was Shelley, I started to wonder whether maybe there were some novelists that I could read. And my tutor suggested that I tried Scott. Now, at that point, I vaguely remembered watching a BBC serialisation of Rob Roy as a child. So I started with that, and then later on, I went on to write my PhD thesis on Scott. Since then, I've written about and taught Scott in many forms. I've been surprised and pleased at how, when students take to Scott, they really do take to him. Every so often at the University of Edinburgh, we have a conversation about how best to introduce Scott into courses. Should we start gently with the minstrelsy and perhaps step up to the Lay of the Last Minstrel? Or should we appeal to students' love of all things Gothic and supernatural and choose The Bride of Lammermoor? Or maybe just go for those great novels that seem to speak most powerfully to the social and moral concerns of the societies Scott depicts, which in recent years at the university have included Rob Roy and The Heart of Midlothian. So it is noticeable how varied Scott is and how much he has to offer to readers of all interests. But here I have a confession to make, apart from the one about the Peel Tower and hiding from Scott. The novel that I have tended not to include on courses is one that for a long time I didn't particularly enjoy reading, however much I admired it. That novel was Waverley. But then things changed. In 2014, I was invited to Berkeley to take part in a symposium on the year 1814 to mark the 200th anniversary of Waverley. Although I was talking about Scott's Lighthouse tour, which took place in the same year, and not Waverley, I thought I would reread it on the 2 flights that it took me to get to San Francisco. And this was a very different reading experience. Just having the chance to spend a concentrated period of time with Waverley meant that I could really appreciate something of what it must be like to read it for the first time, when people had time to read novels, 3-volume novels. Reading it continuously, without the sense that I had to teach it or write about it the next day, was a revelation of its prose rhythms, its controlled movement between people and places, and the suspense of its narrative. I'd forgotten, or perhaps hadn't quite realised until then, how exciting it is. And it was this reading of Waverley that gave me the idea for a book that I'm currently writing on espionage and secrecy in Scottish fiction. Let me start to describe this by telling you a story. At a time of national and political tensions, a young man finds himself in a country that is not quite his own. To his surprise, he is arrested and questioned by the authorities. He is appalled to discover that his recent movements and some items that have been found among his possessions are used to incriminate him. A narrative of treasonous activities seems to explain his recent activities, but as far as he is concerned, he is completely innocent. Is this part of the plot A, of Waverley, 1814, or B, of Eric Ambler's 1838 novel, Epitaph for a Spy? The answer, of course, is that it is both, and the plot motif also recurs in Rob Roy. But I don't offer this simply as a coincidence to emphasise the thrill of reading Waverley. Eric Ambler's spy novels trace the anxiety and uncertainty of individuals who are caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this is something that Scott also understood at a profound level. The German historian Peter Fritzsche writes about Scott's period as a historical state that Fritzsche calls being, I quote, stranded in the present. Now he is talking about the situation in Europe after the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars. By the phrase stranded in the present, he means that individuals felt cut off from their past, from the historical stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of our present. And after the upheavals of war, after the upheavals of war that uprooted populations and redistributed them across Europe, people found themselves looking anxiously at an unknown future, stranded then in a present that was hard to understand. I think that this is a condition that we might recognise today in a variety of contexts around the world. And it is certainly one that Scott recognised in 1814, as Britain was exhausted by a decade of war with France. When the novel was published in July of that year, Europe was struggling to reorder itself after the abdication of Napoleon, and thoughts were turning to the wholesale reorganisation of power that would take place at the Congress of Vienna later that year. Meanwhile, at home, radical movements, disgruntled at the poor treatment of workers and returning soldiers, found their associations infiltrated by government spies. Waverley is, of course, primarily about the 1945 Jacobite Rising, the passing of traditions, the violent destruction of lives and properties in the aftermath of Culloden, and the hesitant possibility of a new political consensus. But I think we can also see in it echoes of Scott's own time, the 1814, the year that it was published. No wonder in the novel Major Melville is suspicious of Edward Waverley, who has been consorting with the French-educated MacIver siblings when he arrests him and finds the incriminating evidence for which Edward denies responsibility. Scott's influence on the European historical novel is now properly acknowledged, and as is the immense and immediate popularity of his fiction throughout Europe. Through Scott, we can understand how history moves on a large scale. But we can also read him in the moment of Waverley's arrest to show us how difficult it is to be in history, to experience it as it swirls around us. Part of Scott's genius is to show us the course of history from above, but also he suggests at the same time that nothing is completely predictable. But reading Scott is not only about the state of global politics. When I was editing the novel The Monastery for the Edinburgh edition, I very much enjoyed doing some research that takes us back to the borders, this time the right side of the borders. The novel opens with one of Scott's more extensive prefaces, in which the fictional narrator, Captain Clutterbuck, a military veteran, has returned to the village of Kennechuer, Melrose. My research for the explanatory notes for this volume took me not only to early 19th century sources, but also to the publications of the local historical society, and these helped me with the details that were stubbornly eluding me. Through the local historians, to take one example, I was able to trace Scott's reference to a certain kind of beer, Vanderhagen's Ale, and I was able to trace this to one Francis Van Hagen, who had recently started a brewery in Melrose at the time of the publication of The Monastery. Sadly, I was not able to sample the beer. But it is details like this that remind us of the living presence of Scott in our local towns and landscapes, and they too are part of the pleasure of reading him. This is a very good time for us as lovers of Scott. I've already mentioned the success of the new poetry edition, and now we see younger, new members joining the club. One of my own PhD students will have her viva tomorrow on a thesis about Scott. And in 2 weeks, some of us here will be in South Carolina for the International Scott Conference. And here, I should say I'm very grateful to the club for a generous donation to our bursary fund that is allowing 2 early career scholars to attend the conference. Meanwhile, Abbotsford continues to blossom, both literally in the beautiful walled garden and figuratively. And so, looking forward to a future of even greater appreciation of Scott, please join me in raising a toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott.
Sir Walter Scott.